I don't mean to put you off coming here. It's been a difficult few months, and the rain never stops, and I am so alone. My name is David Ward. I am in Eskew.
So if I call I Am in Eskew criminally underrated, does that have to mean that it's been rated lower than it deserves? Or could I say that to mean that it hasn't been given enough ratings at all? Because you probably haven't heard of I Am in Eskew. Your friends probably haven't heard of I Am in Eskew. It's honestly one of the best pieces of horror fiction that I've ever come across, and no one seems to have heard of it. And I just really need to talk to someone about how good it is, so that's what I'm going to do in this video. I Am in Eskew is an audio drama that's like the podcast version of a radio play. It follows an unfortunate man named David Ward who lives in the sentient city of Eskew. Each episode, David takes us through some new aspect of the city which is bizarre on the best of days and malicious on the worst. Eskew is a city of wrong angles and impossible pathways and rain that never ever stops. And Eskew takes notice of David. It seems to take David's existence personally, and over the course of the series it begins to evolve. Before we go any further, if that premise appeals to you at all, you should go give the show a listen. All of its episodes and their transcripts are on the show's website, which I will link in the description of this video. And it's also on Spotify and all of the other podcast apps too. It's 30 episodes long, and it is so good. So just go and give it a listen. And if you're new to audio drama, may this video open up a whole new world of content for you, because you've been missing out. I will try to keep spoilers to a minimum in this video, and honestly, Eskew isn't something you can spoil in the traditional sense. Like, stuff happens and things progress, but even if you went into it already knowing everything that was going to happen, I just don't think that would do anything to diminish the atmosphere or the beauty of the storytelling. With that said, I can't discuss the show in the way that I want to without at least a few spoilers, so if that's something that really concerns you, just go give the show a listen and come back. I'll still be here, I promise.
Something has happened to me in the years since I was brought to Eskew. An epiphany, if you like. People no longer frighten me. Places frighten me. I'm never startled here, walking at night by a silhouetted figure staggering down an empty street towards me. Other human beings are always a welcome sight when you're out and alone in Eskew. But I have stopped, in the seeping drizzle of the Strangers' Quarter, finding myself at a sudden intersection of neon signs and brothels and chemists that was, I swear, something else entirely the last time I was walking here. Not knowing where to go, not knowing where I am, not knowing where, if anywhere, I came from.
So this is a video essay about a show. That means that normally this is where I would summarize the show for you from start to end, just to give you the necessary background for the analysis part of the video. That's a bit difficult to do here because I Am in Eskew is episodic. Some episodes have a lasting impact on the characters and setting, but you could probably listen to it in a random order with very little issue. So yeah, I can't really summarize it for you, and I don't really want to anyway because I want you to go listen to it for yourself. So what I'm going to do instead is I'll describe the city of Eskew for you. At first glance, Eskew might seem like any other European city. It has winding cobblestone streets, it has a blend of old and new buildings, maybe there's even some tourist areas. There's a wharf, old brick bridges, a historical society, all the little details that really bring a city to life. I wonder how long it would take you to notice that things aren't quite right in Eskew. Maybe on your first night in the city, you try to walk home to your apartment and realize you don't remember signing a lease. You just have an apartment already. Or maybe on the way up the stairs to the apartment you don't remember leasing, you get the feeling that you've been climbing for way too long. You've climbed too many stairs to have not reached your floor by now. Or maybe it's the people. Maybe it's the native inhabitants of the city that really tip you off. I always imagine that the people of Eskew would have a sort of glazed over look in their eyes, like a stoner or a Mormon dad, because the people of Eskew are not really people. Like, the show doesn't peel back the veil and tell you all of its inner workings, but it heavily implies that the native residents of the city are merely projections. They're one of the many ways that Eskew cosplays as a real city. So the only real people in the city are foreigners, people like our main character, David. Especially early on in the show, Eskew does a decent enough job of mimicking a real place. We're immediately aware of how weird it is. Jesus, I don't even know how to describe the first episode, but there is never any doubt in your mind that things are all kinds of wrong in Eskew. Basically, like, David works at a newspaper and they start getting these love letters for the personal ad section from two people who want to become one. Not like in a erotica euphemism kind of way, but like in a melt down our flesh and become a misshapen mass kind of way. It's yucky. The body horror in this show is skin-crawlingly intense. Yeah, there's never any doubt that Eskew's a bit off, but early on it seems like it could just be an alternate dimension gone wrong scenario. It's not until a few episodes in, when Eskew directly contacts David, using his boss as a mouthpiece, that the listener will begin to get a grasp of what exactly David is up against. Eskew is an alternate dimension, probably, but it's also alive. It thinks, it acts, it plans, it shapes itself, evolving as it acquires new residents from the real world, absorbing and assimilating them. It is a city, it's an alternate dimension, it's kind of a god. Eskew's actual human residents, the foreigners who live in the stranger's quarter of the city, are the kinds of people who slip through the cracks of the real world. People like David who were always a bit weird, a bit melancholy, a bit lonesome. People who struggled to connect with others or who didn't want to connect with others. They drift away from our world to meet a variety of fates in Eskew, usually gruesome ones. David seems to be a cut above or maybe below the other residents of Eskew. Like the others, he never fit in back in his home city of London. He doesn't tell us much about his life there, but you can make inferences from his demeanor. He doesn't refer back to any friends, only to his mother, of whom he shares few memories past early childhood. He speaks about other people in a detached, dry, bitter sort of way that suggests he spent a lot of time observing people and not a lot of time making genuine connections with them. But he seems more resistant to Eskew's influence than others. He's better able to just put his head down and ignore the worst parts of the city. And when that fails, he rolls with the punches surprisingly well. In one episode, after a somewhat out-of-character act of rebellion, David is abducted by an ambulance and brought to a local hospital where he's relegated to the burn unit. This seems to be where Eskew sends its most resilient and rebellious victims, where they have formed a merry band of resistance fighters determined to survive. But all is not as it seems. In giving these subversives a community of their own, Eskew has found a way to assimilate them. You see, the burn unit offers its inhabitants a respite from the city. They're swaddled thoroughly in gauze, such that only their eyes are visible. They're fed semi-regularly, and the food is more or less edible. They find comradeship among each other. The only acute torture for burn unit members is the threat of being pronounced healthy and thrown back outside onto the streets of Eskew. This is, of course, a genius approach on the city's part. By taking its most stubborn foreigners and giving them a break from the city's horrors, it's able to break and mold their minds without even doing much. The gauze wrappings degrade sense of self, and the threat of being forced back outside leaves the residents desperate. And in their desperation, they form a community through which Eskew can sneak into their minds and enact the changes they were previously resistant to, turning them weird, hostile, and paranoid, just like the native inhabitants of the city. The inhabitants of the burn unit have formed a cult of personality around a member called Jacoby, who has created or found or tamed some sort of monstrous creature whose description I won't spoil for you. The other burn unit members are awestruck by this creature. It fills them with the spirit of rebellion. They're determined to carve out a space in the city where they can be safe from its endless stream of nightmares, but David is not convinced.
My feelings of comradeship have, in the past 5 minutes, become somewhat diminished. I think I know that I will not be staying to watch Jacoby's revolution play out against the hospital. If paradise exists, it is not guarded by a creature like this. I will wait until it's my turn to be examined and pronounced healthy and whole, and then I will leave the burn unit behind and head back into Eskew, where at the very least I have an apartment to go back to and recordings to make.
So Eskew breaks out its last resort method to get to David, and he just bounces off it. He sees what the city's up to, he recognizes that the burn unit is no paradise, and he resolves to return to the tenuous life he had going back out in the city. And I think this is what makes Eskew target him so specifically and personally throughout the rest of the show. It doesn't like that it can't break him. It doesn't like that he keeps getting back up. It tries to torture him, it tries to placate him or trick him, and none of it works. And I think the challenge of breaking David is what causes the city to grow and seemingly become more intelligent over the course of the series. It's like the city is honing its skills as it plots new ways to torment him. Okay, so let's rewind a bit and talk some more about David. We are dumped helplessly into the middle of David's story after he's already been in Eskew for 3 years. By this point, he thinks he knows what Eskew is capable of, but soon he learns the hard way, over and over again, that Eskew is not a city that can be known, understood, or predicted. David is not exactly a reliable narrator. He doesn't lie to us, the listener. He's generally pretty honest as far as I can tell. But because he openly distrusts his own perception, because he's never certain who or what or where is real real, it's hard to really trust his portrayal of the city. Like, he knows his mind is cooked. He just can't do much about it. I mean, he literally tells us he takes risperidone, which is an antipsychotic. He references past episodes that don't exist. He forgets episodes that do exist. And he seems to have no clue at all why he's even recording his story. Is he making a travel guide? Is he warning people not to come to Eskew? Is he just keeping a diary? Who knows? At some point, he admits to himself and to us that he's forgetting things on purpose, just stuffing them into the memory hole as a way to cope. And I think he tries to stop doing it, but there's no real way to know if he succeeds. So David's not exactly a reliable narrator, but he's the only narrator we've got, and that leaves us stuck in the same position that he's in, with no choice but to go off the information in front of us, despite never feeling certain if any of it is real. I mean, yeah, the news channels in Eskew cover the weird mass hysteria that turns people into pale worms obsessed with digging a pit. And yeah, the police investigate the disappearance of an entire department at David's work. And yeah, other people very frequently corroborate David's experiences in a variety of ways. But like, what if David's just crazy? And that's what's so insidious about Eskew, the way that it can break a person so thoroughly that they can never trust their own mind again. And really, it doesn't matter if David is crazy. Like, maybe he's been dead the whole time, or maybe he's dreaming, or maybe he's Harry Potter and he's asleep in his bed under the stairs and he's also in a coma, and the world was just created last Thursday with this story already in it. It doesn't matter. The story still means what it means. To be honest, I'm really glad that we, like, as a society, have collectively rejected those kinds of Reddit core theories because they're just so useless. One time I took a fantasy literature class as an elective and we were reading The Last Unicorn, and some guy in the class raised his fucking hand and was like, what if the unicorn's actually just a normal horse and is insane and hallucinating that she's a unicorn? And I audibly groaned in response, and then everyone stared at me, and I was really embarrassed because it was like kind of mean to groan at him, but it just kind of slipped out because, like, what kind of discussion can you even have with a theory like that? It's pointless. Anyway, David Ward. In addition to being delusional to an unknown degree, he's just not an amazing person. He's not evil, he's just not good either. I don't really think a hero character would make it very far in Eskew. David is sullen, he's pessimistic, he's spiteful, and like, he 100% sacrifices a guy to save his own skin on more than one occasion. In episode 13, David starts at a new job, and a coworker tries to befriend him by making subtle references to all the weird shit that's going on around them. But David, a weird, socially awkward man who was almost certainly bullied as a child and wound up in Eskew because he was never able to fit in, even as an adult, has this to say about him.
I have met people like Kenneth before, in Eskew and elsewhere. There's more than a touch of the schoolyard about him. The perpetually bullied adolescent who somehow only grew clumsier and sweatier and more helpless inside his own body as he became an adult. A man who never learnt to pick a haircut or choose clothes that fitted him, or to hide his desperate, lonely agitation when attempting to fit in.
David, you're describing yourself, brother. Like, this is someone who's looking for an ally, who turns out to have a concrete plan for escape, and David just dismisses him. He doesn't want to be seen talking to a cringe loser like Kenneth, because then his freaky Eskew zombie coworkers might think that he's cringe too. We can't have that, can we, David? I mean, Kenneth's escape plan doesn't work, but it's quite possible that it doesn't work because he delays his plans to try to get David to join him. And he spends so long waiting for David to get a fucking clue that Eskew notices and punishes him for it by flaying him and keeping him alive, wheezing, alone in the dark in his escape tunnel that he spent so long digging. I'm not convinced that one could just Shawshank their way out of Eskew, but at the very worst, Kenneth might have just failed. He wouldn't have been mutilated if the city hadn't noticed. So Kenneth is the one who got hurt for associating himself with David, not the other way around. Justice for Kenneth. A lot of David's more questionable decisions make sense under the assumption that he's just doing what he has to do to survive. But the Kenneth thing is different, and it hit me really hard. David saw another down-on-his-luck outcast, and he could have made a friend, or at least an ally, but instead he treated the guy like shit. And honestly, I think a lot of us might do the same. When you're down, it's pretty easy to justify stepping on others for a leg up. David does eventually realize he's misread Kenneth, and he bargains with the city to ease Kenneth's pain. But he never seems to acknowledge what a dick he's been. And that doesn't make David evil or even much of a bad guy. He's just trying to get by, and he unthinkingly mistreats someone, accidentally condemning him to a terrible, terrible fate. And then he kind of makes it a bit better, and then he moves on because he's got his own shit to deal with. It's just so real, man. A lesser writer would have been tempted to make David just a really good guy who's super introspective and self-actualized, and the story would have sucked. Having David be this neurotic, selfish, squirrely little loner makes every point of the story that much sharper. It makes him relatable for the wrong reasons. And that's what allows the horror of Eskew to really shine. A heroic David would not have survived long enough for us to hear his story, and Kenneth's fate drives that home. In a hostile environment like Eskew, reaching out for help or trying to help others will get you killed, or turned into a wheezing lampshade buried in a grave of your own making. That's how Eskew is able to isolate and torment people like David and Kenneth, by training them to keep themselves trapped. So David does make one ally along his journey, a woman by the name of Allegra. Allegra is David's girlfriend. Like David, she was not born in Eskew, but wound up there as an adult. They meet in episode 10, and they hit it off over their shared interest in staying alive and ignoring as much of the weird shit around them as they can. And for the first time since coming to Eskew, David has someone he can lean on.
It's a new beginning. I get up early, switch the kettle on, and listen to the hiss as it rises, merging with the gentle susurrus of the rain pattering down upon the roof. It takes me some time to remember how the ironing board actually works, but eventually I have a smoothed out pair of trousers and a relatively uncreased white shirt. Allegra rises from bed. She takes one look at me and begins to laugh and laugh. I'm not sure she's ever seen me looking so smart.
For a short time, that new relationship glow is enough to keep the darkness of Eskew at bay. David excels at his new job. He's able to swallow his fear and revulsion at the project he's assigned to well enough to be recognized as an asset by his superiors. He doesn't really seem happier, but he seems more confident. So Allegra's presence definitely has a positive effect on his life for a time, and it almost looks like he may have found a place for himself in Eskew. But a trauma bond is never going to be enough to carry a relationship. Not to sound cliche, but you need love and hard work, and above all else, you need trust. And there needs to be a balance of those things coming from both sides of the relationship. Sadly, as much as David finds solace in Allegra, he just can't bring himself to trust her. Not because of anything she's done, and probably not even because of Eskew. David's trust issues go deeper than that. They're probably part of why he ended up in Eskew in the first place. And because of those trust issues, Allegra ultimately becomes another tool for the city to use against him. In episode 14, David and Allegra attend a funeral together. After all the other attendees have thrown themselves into improvised mass graves, David and Allegra sit together atop a hill and share a really beautiful but sad moment. Allegra shares with David the story of how she arrived in Eskew, and it's one that I think a lot of people could relate to. Allegra was on a trip with her friends she had grown distant from, who she'd begun to resent and who'd begun to resent her. She felt like a tag-along, someone who was only invited out of pity or a sense of obligation. Her friends are all closer to each other than they are to her, and she doesn't think they'd even notice her absence. And when Eskew advances to claim her, she's proven right. Allegra offers her story and her pain to David as a show of trust. The story is personal, it's shameful, and it's hard for her to relive. And in return, Allegra would like to know how David came to Eskew. If she were to post on Reddit about this exchange, the commenters would tear her to pieces, insisting he doesn't owe her anything, lambasting her for trauma dumping on him. Her problems are her responsibility to deal with and no one else's. But that just isn't a realistic view of interpersonal relationships, man. It's gotta be about give and take. Human connection is all about sharing pieces of yourself with others and receiving pieces of others in return, like a sticker book full of pieces of people. You simply cannot bear all your burdens alone, and you shouldn't expect the people you love to bear theirs alone either. But David's just not ready. He spent too much of his life so deep in his shell. And Allegra's response to him cuts deep, especially in hindsight once you know the fate in store for her.
I understand if you can't talk about this yet, she says. Really, I do. But I trust you, David. And if you wait too long to trust me, this place is going to change you, or it's going to change me, and then it'll be too late for either of us. So please, don't wait too long.
I won't spoil precisely what happens with Allegra. She doesn't die. This isn't a show where character death is much of a concern, but there's no happily ever after waiting for her and David. It's just not that kind of show. David does learn a lot about himself from his relationship with Allegra, and it allows the show to explore some of the more mundane horrors that can be found in a relationship. Things like the paranoia when your partner is hiding something from you, or the sinking gut feeling of knowing you're not pulling your weight in a relationship, or parenthood. Just parenthood in general, but also parenthood as it relates to fears of your own genetics. Does that make sense? Like, Being afraid of what you might pass on and what it says about you as a person. The fear of an entity that is both a projection of you and also a being all on its own. Yeah, David becomes a parent, and the kid is super normal. It's a super normal kid. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it at all. Anyway, David's relationship with Allegra is the vessel for a lot of his growth throughout the series. They say you shouldn't be in a relationship until you've worked on yourself first, but David needed to learn how to be around other people before he could begin working on himself. And the things he learns from Allegra lead him to transcend Eskew and overcome its challenges in a final episode that fully dives into surreal territory with an open ending that I really love. So there's an entire third of Eskew's story that I've left out of this video so far. Her name is Riyo, and she is not in Eskew. She's a private investigator hired by David's mother to search for him. Riyo's side of the story is actually where most of my story-related criticisms lie, which is unfortunate because her episodes drive a lot of the mystery around what Eskew actually is and how it came to be. I'm going to spoil pretty much all of Riyo's story here, so if you're trying to avoid that, there should be a timestamp on screen that you can skip to. Riyo used to be a government agent of some sort. She worked for something called the Grey Room, which is like an intelligence agency of some kind, or maybe military, I'm not sure. But it's where she met her husband, who she loved very much, but he was more of a free spirit and wanted to go out in the world and have adventures, and she wanted a more domestic life, I think. So they were separated, and then he went missing in a military operation that I think he might have been on the wrong side of, and now Riyo is retired from government work and solves problems for a living. When David's mother hires her, she sees the word Eskew written on David's doorframe, and it catches in her mind like the word itself has power. She gets in touch with an old contact from her government agent days and learns about a group called the Orion Building Concern. At this point, the listener will already be familiar with the name because it's where David works, but now we learn that it exists outside of Eskew, and that it may have even created Eskew.
I read about this in your book, I prompt him. Hostile architecture. I find it fascinating and appalling, Professor Henley says, that we apply that term exclusively to spaces that oppress rough sleepers. The homeless are our canaries in the coal mine of exterior landscape because they have no escape from it, unlike the rest of us. We can retreat into the private spaces of our homes and our heads, after all. Could someone create such a space? I ask him, as if it's just occurred to me. Deliberately, I mean. It would be abhorrent, he says, lying with grace and simplicity. But academically speaking, possible.
Riyo tracks down a man who she believes helped build Eskew. It was an experiment in hostile architecture, a village called Banwell. Basically, they wanted to see what would happen if they built a town where none of the angles were quite right, and the acoustics were fucked, and the stairs had too many flights, and the doors led nowhere, and everything felt wrong on a subconscious level. So they built it, and they rounded up some convicts and immigrant families, people no one would miss, and they sent them to live in Banwell, and all of them vanished. We learned that Banwell isn't actually Eskew, it just became a crossing point to Eskew, one of many. So Riyo searches one out and heads into Eskew to search for David. If this backstory and storyline sound really interesting to you, I actually feel the same. But I don't think they're presented in an effective way. Riyo's episodes are framed as voicemails left on her husband's phone. At first, they're only addressed to you, and they refer to the intended listener as an impatient man. So the initial mystery of who she's speaking to is pretty compelling. But unfortunately, as you get answers, you begin to suspect that maybe her story wasn't planned out very far in advance. You're like, okay, who's she talking to? It sounds like maybe a boyfriend or something. Why does she not know where he is? That's intriguing. Maybe he's in Eskew too. Oh, it's because he's dead. He's been dead the whole time, and she just likes to pretend he's still out there in the world on an adventure. Oh, and they were married, not just dating, because that's played as a reveal. Okay. A good mystery needs to become more intriguing as you learn more up until it all comes together, or it needs to tie into the rest of the story somehow, or just generally it needs to be more than just, actually the narrator was pretending the whole time. The themes of Riyo's story center around finding or creating a place to call home, or finding a home within yourself, and I think that's really lovely, but the execution just fell flat for me. I think if Riyo were to encounter David's mom while searching for her missing husband without knowing that he's already dead, that would have been much more compelling. Instead, it feels feels like she's doing so much for the son of a woman she met for like a few minutes. And they don't like bond or anything. It's a very quick professional meeting with David's mom, and then Riyo goes beyond the ends of the earth for her. This is just me spitballing, but maybe Riyo's husband could have disappeared in similar circumstances to David, and she could connect with David's mom through a contact from her old line of work. And that could be how she ends up on the trail of Eskew. Maybe she hopes to find her husband there, or maybe she's finally notified of his death and her grief is what causes Eskew to finally open up for her. I do know from reading interviews that Eskew's storyline wasn't fully planned out in advance. It sounds like they took it one episode at a time, especially at the beginning, since they didn't know if anyone would even be listening or if they'd even enjoy making a podcast. I guess they did enjoy making a podcast because they made another one after Eskew that was like much more ambitious and it became quite popular. I like that one. It's called The Silt Versus. I just think Eskew is better. Anyway, it made sense for Eskew to not be fully planned out from the beginning, but in retrospect, I think a mystery story especially needs a lot more forethought and planning than another type of story, and that's probably why Riyo's story fell flat. I do also think that Riyo's episodes needed to stand out more from David's episodes. David's side of the story is already in Eskew, so it makes sense for his story to be disjointed and at times confusing. It contributes to the overall sense that Eskew is a place that messes with your head. Riyo is not in Eskew, so I wish her story would have come together in a slightly more clear and linear way instead of having tiny details about her drip fed to us. Not that she needs to come right out and be like, hello, my name is Riyo and my husband died. But surely there's an in-between option where we don't wait until the final few episodes of the show and only then learn that she was actually married to the guy she's talking to, and also he's been dead this whole time and she knew that already. If we go further down this line of criticism, Riyo's episodes are sparse compared to David's, and I think they would have highlighted the differences between Eskew and Our World if her narration didn't have the same tone and atmosphere as David's episodes. Just to inject a bit of background that I couldn't find a spot for earlier in this script, Eskew was created by husband and wife duo John Ware and Mona Hassan, with him doing the writing and the voice of David, and her doing the audio production and the voice of Riyo. So I think Mona Hassan was trying to emulate the narration style that her husband uses for David, which is totally understandable because his narration is really captivating in a subtle sort of way. It creeps into your mind and the gentle rhythm makes you almost not notice the freaky shit he's saying, and then that makes it even more freaky, and I really like it. He's just naturally a very good narrator. Not that Mona isn't, it's just that because she adopts a style so similar to his, Riyo doesn't feel like a fully realized separate character. I would have liked a bit more zest, a bit more intensity, a bit more desperation, something new to make Riyo's episodes stand out and keep the listener really engaged in her part of the story. I hope I haven't come off like I think Riyo's story is really, really bad. It's not. It's still really good, especially when she talks to the professor who helped build Banwell. It's like distressingly plausible. Really, a lot of Eskew is just taking the horrific things that happen in real life and stretching them to a degree that's currently fictional. And having a separate character whose story leads them to Eskew is a really brilliant choice. It just didn't work as well as it could have. Maybe one day they'll remaster the show and adjust Riyo's story to be a bit cleaner. That would be really cool. Alright, this is getting long as hell, so I'm going to rattle off some general likes and dislikes for the show that I couldn't fit in elsewhere, and then I'll wrap up. Let's do dislikes first so that I can close out on a positive note. Number 1, and this is the biggest one, the audio balancing of the show is not great. It was an amateur production, and you can definitely tell. The intro sting of the show is beautifully discordant and grating, and it sets an excellent tone, but unfortunately they use a different sting as a scene transition, and it's this jarring whoosh sound that's definitely too loud compared to the narration. There's also a plotline later in the series that involves overlapping narration, and one of the voices is way too quiet to hear, but just loud enough that you can barely understand the other voice. So I needed the online transcripts to understand what was going on. That was not a great call. Number 2, David's mom is revealed at the very end to have been verbally abusive, and it just doesn't work for me. It's very abrupt. There's indicators throughout the series that his mom was loving, maybe ill-equipped for parenthood, but never does David give us any indication that she was so relentlessly cruel until it's thrown in at the very end. I just don't think it enhances his story. I think it would have been more powerful for her to have loved him, but just been unable to figure out what he needed to thrive. But it's such a last-minute detail that it doesn't really matter much in the grand scheme of things. Number 3, the show frequently uses a specific visual to represent Eskew's physical projections. It's introduced in episode 2, and I think it works really well in the specific context of that episode, but after that, it's just not it. It's like a charcoal outlined blank-eyed face. It comes up several times as a primary aspect of the city, like its main form. Most of the visuals in the show are so visceral and unique, and I found this one to be trite. It just didn't work for me. Now I get to move on to things I like about the show, which is everything else, and I'm doing 5 instead of just 3 because it's my video and I can do what I want. So these are in no particular order. Number 1, I love David's sense of humor. I will go to my grave insisting that horror is the other face of comedy, not tragedy. And John Ware is great at writing both. Is that actually what those masks mean? I'm not really sure. I love David's bitterness and sarcasm, and when he cracks little jokes or makes passive-aggressive comments, it's impossible not to like him. Number 2, I love the ending. I'm not going to spoil it, which makes it hard to discuss, but let me try. David and Dio do meet up, and together they take on the city, but not in a cool superhero team-up kind of way. It's more like, hey, we're on 2 different journeys, but our paths have crossed. Let's march together for a time until fate parts us. I imagine there are a lot of people who didn't like the ending because it gets pretty metaphorical and abstract, but I think it's beautiful and it moves me to tears every time. Probably because it's always late at night when I listen to it and I cry very easily, but still, I like it. Number 3, for all my criticism of the show's audio, I think it does a lot of things right. The constant hum of rain in the background of each episode sets a dreary tone that matches the futility of David's situation. The fuzzy quality of the audio matches that vibe and makes for, in my opinion, really easy listening. The few sound effects that are included in the show are well chosen and well implemented, but even better are the onomatopoeia sounds the narrators use later on. Number 4, can I include the entire city of Eskew as a thing I liked? I've just never encountered anything quite like it in anything I've read, watched, played, listened to. Yes, at first glance, it's just an alternate dimension or a purgatory or a mind palace or something, but really it's all of those things and none of them at the same time. It's malicious, but it's also prideful and can be placated. It's like Pinocchio wanting to be a real city, but doing a lot of bad things along that quest. Eskew is baby. Number 5, I love the show's episodic writing. Episodic writing seems really hard to me as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about writing and not a lot of time doing it. I'm really impressed with the consistent quality of each episode, but my personal favorite, which I didn't even talk about in this video because it would have been a 4-hour video if I did, is episode 15, Tenancy. The episode where David gets a roommate. If you listen to one episode of Eskew, let it be Tenancy. But overall, I just think the show does an amazing job of having these separate contained stories that connect so delicately, forming a beautiful whole that progresses almost unseen toward a conclusion that feels earned. That seems really hard to pull off, but they did it, and I love it. I love this show. I've been wanting to collect my thoughts about this show for a long time, and I hope I did it justice. It's eerie and it's haunting, but it's also poetic. I first listened to it in the early months of the pandemic, which for most of us was a time characterized by loneliness and separation. A time where we all felt so disconnected from each other, where we were so sick of our own houses, but when we did go out, the streets were empty and seemed alien. At least that's how it was for me. I think at that time, many of us were in Eskew. Sometimes I feel like we never left it. I guess we're all just David Ward trying to find a place for ourselves in a world that feels increasingly hostile. If you're still watching this far into the video, thank you so much for being here. This is my first time making a YouTube video, and I'm sure I have a lot to learn, but I've wanted to take this plunge for a long time, and it's cool to finally be doing it. If you enjoyed the video, I'm sure you know all the things you can do to show me that. Like, comment, subscribe, swear your firstborn to me, anything to feed the algorithm. I also stream on Twitch over at twitch.tv/tempestinateacup. I just transitioned into variety streaming after maining one game for a really long time, so things are very new and exciting over there. Come check it out. Until next time.